at the time, and I think as long as those conditions are met, then the court is going to allow it. The court has reviewed the case. It was cited by counsel, 618 Southern 2nd, 1313, and I find that that language tells the court that as long as the witness is able to verify it as a substantial representation of the conditions existing at the time, then it should be allowed. Turning now to the Thelma Taylor, the court finds that Thelma Taylor's name was not disclosed timely to the defendant. I find that the remedy to that will be that the defense shall be allowed to interview Ms. Taylor before she testifies. I don't find any unfair surprise or prejudice resulting in the discovery violation. All right, anything further? Is that clear enough for you?
It is, Your Honor.
Thank you. All right, you may call your next witness. Well, I need the jury. All right, Ms. Taylor.
They call Major Barry Thompson.
All right. One doesn't do it, two probably won't either. All right, Ms. Taylor.
Your Honor, Detective Thompson still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Major Thompson, you've already been involved in conducting the site visits for this jury, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And I'm going to move you back to December 6th of 2014, okay?
Yes.
On December 6th of 2014, it was a Saturday, you've already mentioned you were not at home, is that correct?
No, sir, I was out of time.
And when did you arrive back in town?
Late that Sunday.
Were you involved in any search or any collection around the crime scene?
No, sir.
Now, you did become involved and acquainted with the investigation when you arrived back, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And I'm not gonna describe it as a lead, but would you agree that for your agency, you were more of the point man to talk to with your agency?
Yes, sir. I was kind of, once I got back, myself and Lieutenant Dixon, everything was basically funneled through us for my agency.
For your agency, but there was a lot of other agencies involved, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
An analyst also became involved to where information was funneled directly to him that did not go through you. Would that be accurate?
That's right. If other agencies were compiling information, it didn't necessarily have to come directly to me. Paul Rowlett with the U.S. Department of Justice became involved, I believe, the Wednesday of that week, which would be the 10th, from his office, where information was either scanned and emailed or faxed or hand-delivered, however it may have been. Then that following Monday, he actually set up at our command post in the conference room at the sheriff's office.
And he ultimately arrived on site collecting all the data, correct?
That's correct.
Did you learn about some things that occurred on the scene that night?
As I told you before, I was constantly on the phone during the initial part of the investigation. I did know some of the details that were being put out, yes.
I guess what I'm getting at is when you arrived back in town, did you learn that some firefighters had looked at an individual with suspicion on that night?
Yes.
Was that an individual that was down toward the crime scene?
Yes, sir.
And did they end up having to run this individual off?
That was information was received that I think one of the firemen had asked him to leave or get away from the crime scene, and eventually he was told if he didn't leave, they would have a deputy to remove him.
And did Daniel Cole ultimately receive a tag number for this individual?
Yes,
And was the tag number run?
yes,
And are you aware of who that tag came back to?
yes, sir. Thelma Taylor.
And does Thelma Taylor have a husband?
She does. It's Willie Taylor.
Do you know where they live?
I do.
Where is that?
If everybody remembers during the site visit where the post office or that church with the green roof was located at the mouth of Old 51, it's a large brick house directly east of there behind the post office.
Is he an older or younger individual?
He's an older gentleman.
During your investigation, did you find out that they had a child that lived in Courtney Village?
Yes.
Is Courtney Village very close to the crime scene at Harrow Road?
If everybody remembers where we left Main Street, past the site where the keys were collected, there was a little road to the left before you got onto Heron Road. That was Courtney Village subdivision.
At any time was Willie Taylor a suspect for the murder? Excuse me. Did officers still look into Willie Taylor because his name was there?
He was, I believe, brought in and interviewed, and also his phone records tolls were pulled by Rowlett.
You didn't have any direct contact with Willie Taylor.
No, sir.
Was he ultimately cleared as a suspect in this murder?
Through the total investigation and Paul Rowlett's work, yes, sir.
There were some items collected at the scene.
Yes, sir.
One of those items was a phone belonging to Jessica Chambers.
Yes, sir.
What was the original piece of evidence that was looked into this day, in the following week?
Her phone was a primary source of evidence because it was, I believe the phone was given, I know the phone was a dump or told, records were pulled on her phone to see who the most recent people she had been in contact with were.
And you mentioned records were retrieved,
Yes, sir.
and I'm not going to gloss over the fact, did you contact Daniel Cole about getting statements from first responders?
Yes, sir.
And from those statements, was there a name that resonated?
Yes, sir.
And what was that name?
From the statements, a lot of the firemen had heard what they believed to be Eric or Derek.
And was Eric or Derek initially the thought?
Yes, sir.
As an investigator, did you close your investigation to only Eric's or Derek's?
No, sir.
Were there tips coming in all the time
Constantly,
from everywhere?
especially our friends on social media.
And did you and other investigators attempt to check into several of the Eric's or Derek's? And Mr. Rowlett's going to testify at length regarding that, and also these tips.
Yes, sir.
And you're one man. There were numerous people conducting interviews, correct?
Oh, yes, sir. There were, I'd hate to even put a number on the amount of investigators that were wanting to help and were going in directions, interviewing. Somebody was interviewing all the time.
Also, were individuals with the Marshal Service scouring her phone?
Yes, sir.
And were they able to retrieve the numbers that she was in contact with?
Yes, sir.
And was one of those unnamed numbers later identified as Quentin Tellis?
Yes, sir.
And would you tell the jury what a contact interview is?
A contact interview in a case like this, when you don't have let's just say one viable suspect that you're walking into that you're going to interrogate about a crime that you believe he is actually the one that committed. When you do a contact interview with somebody, it is similar to a witness interview, with the exception of most of the time you will, just to protect them, and if they later become a viable suspect, you'll advise them of their rights. It's an information gathering interview where it's just, where were you at this time? Were you with this person on this day? It's an information gathering interview is what I'd like to phrase it as.
And would you agree with me, in Jessica's phone, some numbers had names on them
Yes,
and some didn't?
yes.
Those that did not have names on them, how were the Marshal Services running those people down?
By subpoenaing the provider and get the owner information of the number.
And were they also just simply calling?
Yeah, a lot of them were just called to come in, of course.
Did it take time, did it take either short time or long time, differing times to bring these individuals?
Yeah, I mean, it was varying. Some of them we found very quickly, and some of them it took a few days or longer.
On December 10th of 2018, 4 days after the death of Jessica Chambers, did you and another officer conduct a contact interview with Quentin Tellis?
Yes, sir, myself and Special Agent Douglas.
And was he read a rights waiver, as you said, to protect him and protect you?
Yes, sir.
Detective Thompson, or Major Thompson now, will you identify this document for me?
Yes, sir, this is, well, the heading on it is Criminal Investigation Bureau Interrogation Advice of Rights, otherwise commonly known as a Miranda Warning.
And is that the Miranda Warning or Advice of Rights that you gave to Quentin Tellis on December 10th, 2014?
Yes, sir. I was present. According to the handwriting, Investigator Douglas would have actually read it and gotten his information. I was present and signed it as a witness.
Your Honor, I would offer this as an exhibit to this witness' testimony.
Any objection?
None, Your Honor.
All right, be marked and admitted.
Page 93.
Major Thompson, most of our population, probably these jurors, have not seen that form before. Can you explain to them what that form is? Certainly they'll have it to look at in the jury room.
Yes, sir. The Miranda Warning is, of course, it's called Miranda because of a case that was, I guess, decided in court. But it is a notification that is given to a criminal suspect or a person. And then when you're going into an interrogation, it's called a custodial interrogation. A custodial interrogation is when you have somebody that's not free to leave and you're asking them questions directly about a crime. In these situations, a lot of these people were given this just to protect their rights, and our case, should they become a viable suspect, it couldn't come back on me that I didn't advise them of their rights had I gained valuable information in the contact interview.
Is there certain rights you have to advise them of?
Yes.
Would you read those rights for the jury?
Yes, sir. It's, before we ask you any question, you must understand your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to talk to a lawyer for advice before I ask you any questions, and have a lawyer with you during questioning. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you before any questioning if you wish. If you decide to answer questions now without a lawyer present, you will have the right to stop answering at any time. You also have the right to stop answering at any time until you talk to a lawyer.
And did you advise were those rights advised to Quentin Tellis?
They were, and actually, this form doesn't have it, but a line was drawn, and each individual right is initialed QT beside each individual right.
And did he agree to waive his rights and speak to you?
After he acknowledged each right, there's a subparagraph that says waiver of rights under that. After having that read to him, he did sign his name, Quentin V. Tellis.
Well, in full disclosure, would you read that waiver?
Yes, sir. It says, I've read the statement of my rights and I understand what my rights are. I'm willing to make a statement and answer questions. I do not want a lawyer at this time. I understand and know what I'm doing. No promises or threats have been made to me, and no pressure or coercion of any kind has been used against me.
And as you said, he signed that form.
Yes.
You can hand it back to the court reporter. After that was a contact interview or fact-gathering interview conducted on Quentin Tellis.
Yes, sir, it was.
Did you ask how Quentin Tellis met Jessica?
I did.
Excuse me, did he acknowledge he knew Jessica?
He did. He said he'd known her for 2 or 3 weeks, I believe, is what he told me.
And how did he tell you he met her?
Said that he had met her through Lakeisha Meyer, a mutual friend, I guess, but met her through Lakeisha Meyer.
And how did he state he got her number?
I think he stated that she gave it to him.
And they began communicating.
Yes, via text or talking.
Did he tell you mostly what they would do when they were hanging out?
Yes, sir. The three of them three of them were sometimes him and her, I guess, but the three of them would ride around and smoke dope, which was later confirmed to be marijuana, most likely.
And did he indicate who was smoking marijuana to you?
Jessica and Keisha.
Did you ever ask him if he had any type of relationship with Jessica Chambers?
I believe we posed the question to Mr. Tellis is was he in an intimate relationship with Miss Chambers?
What was his answer to that?
Initially, it was no, but he did come back and say we had sex one time.
And you're aware he later confirmed in a subsequent interview to Dustin Blunt where they had sex?
Yes, sir.
Now, ultimately in this fact-gathering interview, were you trying to find out Quentin Tellis' whereabouts at a certain time?
We were.
And what particular time was that?
I think the time frame we used was probably between 5 and 8 or 6 and 8. You know, we knew the time of the crime was, the call was actually around 8 p.m. or a little after, so we used a gap of time, maybe 5 to 8 or 6 to 8.
Well, let me ask you, what significant event happened in that gap of time?
The burning of Jessica Chambers.
Were you trying to figure out Quentin Tellis' whereabouts during the time frame before and after her death?
I was.
Or her burning, not her ultimate death?
Yes.
And did he in fact tell you who he was with?
He did.
And where did he tell you he was and who did he tell you he was with?
He told me that during the time of the time frame that I'd given him, or the block of time, that he had been in the Sandbox area of Cortland with Michael Sanford, also known as Big Mike, and Terry Shegog, who goes by the nickname of Tootie.
All right, I'm going to ask you about the Sandbox. This is first I think we've heard of it. Can you tell us where we went down to Cortland today,
Yes.
and did we go through the Sandbox?
No.
Can you tell the jury where the Sandbox would be located in Cortland?
You referred to it twice when we were at the fire station, and you said we're going up the hill. When we got to that stop sign, had you not turned on 51 to go back north, had you continued east about 3 or 4 miles, you would have come out at McNeely, and that area right there east of Cortland is called the Sandbox area.
And what is the Sandbox area?
It's just I don't know why they call it. They call it that. I think it was old gravel pit or something over there at one time, but they call it the Sandbox area of Cortland.
Is it an area where people live and hang out?
Yeah. Yes.
This was not a long contact interview, correct?
No, sir. It probably lasted just a few minutes.
During the course of your conversation with Quentin Tellis, this is 4 days after Jessica Chambers was burned, is that correct?
Yes.
And I believe you mentioned our friends on social media, names had rung out in the community.
Yes.
Did the name Eric get out into the public that you're aware of?
Yes. It was definitely out there. I mean, social media was exploding with Eric's and Derek.
And did Quentin Tellis also try to give you a name?
Quentin did give me a name. He told me that he believed that Derek Holmes had been stalking Jessica.
Based on Quentin telling you that, was Derek Holmes analyzed as a potential suspect?
Derek Holmes was a contact interview was performed with him, as well as his phone was dumped and his tolls and records were sent to Paul. And
Well, let me ask you, what part did you have in any investigation of Derek Holmes?
I did an initial contact interview in which he gave an alibi of being with his mother. I got his phone information and passed it to Paul.
Okay. All the other information would have been collected by somebody else in regards to him.
That's correct. And a follow-up interview was actually done by, I believe, Agent Meadows and Agent Douglas.
And are you aware of whether, after the full analysis of Derek Holmes, he was a viable suspect for the murder of Jessica Chambers?
No, sir, he wasn't.
Was he cleared?
Yes.
Now, in a lot of these early contact interviews, did we have an item in evidence that we knew belonged to Jessica Chambers?
We did.
And what was that?
Her keys.
And had those keys been prepared or sent off for analysis?
If they weren't in transit, they were prepared to be shipped to compare with any possible samples we might collect.
And when you say compare, what comparison for what?
DNA.
We didn't have any profile back from the DNA lab yet.
No, sir.
In anticipation of the possibility did you collect DNA samples from several of these initial individuals?
We decided very on in the investigation, after locating her keys, that that was a great avenue, that we needed, that anybody that would provide a voluntary sample, that we would collect it from them and send it down to have it compared to those keys.
Now, when the keys were found, you sent an investigator out to, or actually a narcotics investigator, to retrieve those keys.
Yes,
And based on the individuals involved, did you authorize DNA samples to be taken from Jerry King, Mary Tyner, and Anna King?
yes,
Anna King being the baby.
yes, sir, I did.
And was that done?
Yes, sir, it was.
Did you also request consent for a DNA sample from Quentin Tellis?
I did.
And did Quentin Tellis consent to a DNA sample?
Yes, sir, he did, voluntarily.
Major Thompson, I'm going to show you a one-page form. Can you identify this form?
Yes, sir, this is just a form, DNA consent form. It's got the date, the time that I'm asking for the consent, where I am at while I'm asking for the consent, who I'm asking for the consent from, and then the body of it has a waiver in it telling him why and what I'm trying to do.
Is that a DNA consent form that Quentin Tellis signed on December 10, 2014?
Yes, sir, it's signed by Mr. Tellis, witnessed by Mr. Dixon, and signed by me as the person who was taking the sample.
Mr. Dixon being the investigator that testified previously.
Yes, Lieutenant Dixon.
Your Honor, I would ask that this document be offered and received.
Any objection?
None, Your Honor.
All right, be marked in it.
Major Thompson, I'm also going to show you a envelope. Can you identify that particular envelope?
Yes, sir, this is for lack of a better term, I'm gonna use a pre-packed DNA collection kit from Scales Biological Laboratory in Brandon, Mississippi.
And do they provide you with these pre-packed kits so you can sufficiently take samples?
Yes, sir, it's pre-packed in a way that I can get a swab from each interior of each cheek and then have a prefab envelope that's got all the information that they need to input this sample and run.
And the Scales Biolab also provide you some training on how to conduct these samples.
They do it. It's very informal, I guess is best the word to say, but if they will tell you exactly what they want and how they want you to do it as far as collecting their samples for them.
And did you in fact do that after obtaining consent from Mr. Tellis? Did you in fact conduct a? Did you get a DNA sample from him?
Yes, sir, I did.
Your Honor, I would offer this exhibit as witness testimony.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Be marked and admitted.
Sorry, I'm overthinking myself. Last few questions. When did he tell you, did he admit to being with Jessica on December the 6th of 2014?
Yes, sir, he did before
And
noon.
when,
He told me before noon, I believe is what he said.
he admitted to what we've already heard described as the ride around between him and Keisha and Jessica.
Yes.
Did you ask him whether he had seen Jessica after noon that day?
I believe the question that I think he told us he had been with her before noon, and I think he never said he was with her after noon. He said during the crime he had been in the sandbox with the other guys.
And did he ever tell you that he went to Batesville on December 6, 2014 in the afternoon?
I don't believe that was part of my interview.
Did he ever mention going to Batesville?
No, sir.
This happened in early December, and I believe the jury's probably seen you giving some directions to some court officials. Do you also hold another hat with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department?
Yes, sir, I do. I'm head of courtroom security.
And December is what I consider a dead time for the court system.
Yes, sir.
This year, it was not.
No, sir.
You were involved in the early, middle part of December in this investigation, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, once January starts, what kicks up?
First week of January, circuit court starts wide open here in Panola County and other counties, and that's,
And are y'all also a smaller county?
yes,
And you are not a huge sheriff's department.
no, sir.
Some other agencies with more advanced equipment had come in and helped, is that right?
That's correct.
In January, did you go back to assume your normal duties of being in the courtroom?
Yes, sir.
And I would say the lead or the point people for this investigation shrank to a smaller group. Would that be correct?
Yes, sir. It was basically, we were still involved. I mean, as they got information, they were still relaying information to us and having us involved. If we gained any information, we turned it over to them. Basically, starting in January, investigators Rowlett, Douglas, and Meadows pretty much took over the hands-on part of it.
The jury has not met any of them. Will you tell the jury who they are and what agency they are from?
I will. It's Paul Rowlett with the U.S. Department of Justice, Scott Meadows with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and Special Agent Tim Douglas with the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation.
And would they periodically keep you up to date on what was going on?
We would, of course, being in court with you and Mr. Champion, we would also talk about it because the information would come to y'all also.
But you and the Sheriff's Department in general did not take an active role in this investigation after that, is that correct?
Most of the interviews post that and information gathered, those three handled. Yes, sir.
Last thing, Lieutenant Dixon's already testified to his processing of the crime scene. And I believe, and he's already mentioned going out early the next day in the daylight. Can you tell the jury when the keys were found? Are you aware?
I'm not exactly sure what day Tyler recovered.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm going to show you the keys that have been previously marked in the evidence. Can you tell me the date those keys were recovered?
Yes, sir. They were recovered on December the 8th, 2014 at 3:45 in the afternoon. That would have been the Monday.
And were you back at work at that point?
Yes, sir.
Based on the keys being located, did someone at the Sheriff's Department or you contact Daniel Cole in regards to a further search?
Yes, sir. I'm not sure if it was me or if it was done, or if I directed somebody to do it. It was a lot of people there that were contacting people for me and other investigators. But Daniel Cole, being the head of DOC, he has a search and rescue team that has the deputies, firefighters, as well as regular volunteers. Because we are a small county, we do have people that volunteer to help in large searches. A search and rescue team was assembled that went out and broadened the search of the area based on the keys being found a distance from the crime scene.
And are you aware if that search resulted in any other items of evidence pertaining to the death investigation of Jessica Chambers being recovered?
To my knowledge, no other valuable items were recovered.
Your Honor, I tender the witness.
All right. Cross? Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson.
Good afternoon, Mr. Peterson.
Briefly, Mr. Thompson, you are, I believe, third in command with the Panola County Sheriff's Department.
That's correct.
And who will be second in command?
Our Chief Deputy, Chris Franklin.
And then I assume the first in command will be the actual sheriff.
That's Sheriff Darby.
You were, I believe you actually talked about being out of town on the date of this incident, which would have been December 6, 2014.
Yes,
But you were in contact with your colleagues within the Sheriff's Department via phone
Yes, sir.
for a substantial amount of time, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were not actually involved in the collection of any evidence in this case, were you not?
No, sir.
Okay. Most of that would have been collected or done by other law enforcement individuals.
Yes, sir.
But you were involved with the initial, I believe you referred to it as a contact interview with Mr. Tellis.
Yes.
And that interview took place on December the 10th, correct?
Yes, sir.
What led you to contacting Mr. Tellis for this interview in the first place?
We knew from Jessica's phone records that they were talking and they were friends and they were talking. It was just as we did with everybody we got identified in their phone, we did an initial contact interview.
Okay.
Like I told him, it was an information gathering interview, in no way accusatory, just trying to find out what the nature of the relationship was.
Understood. So it'd be fair to say that the initial information that caused you to interview Mr. Tellis would have been information that you obtained from Ms. Chambers' phone.
Yes.
Okay. And,
Excuse me, but it also, at this point, I believe Lakeisha Meyer had been interviewed, and she may have told us that they were together that morning. I know she had been interviewed as well.
okay. Did you interview Ms. Meyer?
I think I sat in on a couple of her interviews. She was interviewed several times, Mr. Peterson. I believe I sat in on a couple of her interviews.
Certainly. So if Mr. Tellis was actually contacted on December 10th, that would mean that Ms. Meyer was interviewed prior to that contact interview of Mr. Tellis.
I believe she was interviewed prior to that. I'm not sure, but I know his information came out of her phone. We knew they had been in contact.
Okay. So you sure the information that led you to Mr. Tellis would have come from Ms. Chambers' phone?
Yes.
And it may have been contributed to
You know,
somewhat.
at some point, Ms. Meyer backed it up. I'm not going to promise you that information was before, but like I said, she was interviewed several times.
Understood. Now, you testified earlier about an individual who was run from the crime scene.
Yeah, you're talking, not physically running. We was asked to leave. Okay, yes, sir.
And I apologize.
Yes, sir.
I'm working from my notes here,
Yes,
but
sir.
Mr. Hale was asking you about an individual who, and I have ran from the crime scene, but he was encouraged to depart from the crime scene.
Yes,
Is that
sir.
a better phrase?
Yes, yes.
That individual, we know now was a Willie Taylor.
Yes, sir.
Have you actually interviewed Mr. Taylor?
I have not interviewed Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor's an over-the-road truck driver, familiar to the community. Miss Taylor was actually the one interviewed, and I believe either Mr. Meadows or Mr. Rowlett spoke with him via telephone because he was in Texas.
Okay. Now, you testified that Mr. Taylor's phone records were told?
Another investigator, being Mr. Rowlett, would have to answer as far as the GPSing of his phone. But being his name came up, I'm going to say that he was, because Rowlett
Okay.
checks pretty much
Well,
everything.
I'm just trying to clarify your testimony from when you were talking to Mr. Hale a
Yes.
minute ago. But you said that Willie Taylor's phone records were told. Do you know that to be the case for a fact?
An absolute fact, no, but I know every person that we turned over to Mr. Rowlett, he ran their phone records.
Okay. And then you said you remember his tag being run.
Yes,
Did I understand you correctly?
yes. It's in our logbook,
Certainly.
but it'll be part of the discovery, but it was Daniel Cole, I believe, called into our dispatch center and gave them a tag number that was passed on to him by the fireman.
So it's your belief that the information reflecting that the tag, which came back to Willie Taylor,
No, it actually came back to Thelma.
my apologies, the tag that came back to Thelma Taylor would have been in your logbook at the sheriff's office?
Well, it would have been in our dispatch center.
And you referred to it being in discovery.
It should have been turned over. It's the logbook of the entire night of the full crime run. I mean, the full case.
But you don't know that to be the case.
It is in Panola County Sheriff's Dispatch logbook, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, the phone of Jessica Chambers, this would have been the phone, there's been testimony and some pictures. You were not present for that, but that phone was actually found at the scene of the incident where the burning occurred.
Yes.
Where the car was ultimately extinguished by firefighters.
Yes,
And there was information actually retrieved from that phone.
yes, sir. I mean, the
Okay.
phone was a dump and phone records were retrieved. I didn't have anything to do with the dumping or collection of evidence from a phone.
Certainly, you're aware of it being dumped,
Yes,
but you were not a part of the process where it was dumped.
no, sir, I'm not qualified for that.
Okay. Would this also have been something that was reported to you by your colleagues?
Like I said, there were several people, numerous investigators working on this, and if somebody was identified in the phone, I could have been one to interview them, or it could have been one of numerous other investigators. We just kind of, everything was dished out evenly to somebody that went and interviewed somebody. It was constantly interviews going on.
I understand that, Mr. Thompson. I guess my point I'm getting to is, I'm going back through your direct testimony, but
Yes.
you testify that the phone of Jessica Chambers was ultimately dumped.
Yes,
So my follow-up question would be, how do you know that?
well, I believe after Mr. Rowlett got set up at the sheriff's office, the records were actually put up on the wall, or, I mean, they were being distributed. I mean,
So you've seen some records which would have indicated this dump?
Yes.
Do you know what happened to the actual phone?
no,
Would it be, at one point, it was at the sheriff's department,
initially when it was collected, it was at the sheriff's office.
okay? Was the dump actually performed there at the sheriff's department?
I have no idea.
Quintellis's number was actually a number in that phone, correct?
To my knowledge, yes, sir.
Now, you conducted the contact interview with Mr. Tellis.
Myself and Special Agent Douglas, yes, sir.
Where did this interview take place?
In my office at the sheriff's department.
So did you all actually go and pick up Mr. Tellis, or did you call him and he came down, or?
I believe, and I'm not sure, we had several people that are very familiar with that area that would, if we had somebody we wanted to interview, we generally didn't leave. We would have somebody pick them up. I'm not sure if he actually came himself, or if maybe Albert Perkins or Darius Smith might have picked him up. I'm not sure. He came voluntarily to give an interview.
He was there voluntarily?
Yes, sir.
Was this the first time that you're aware of Mr. Tellis being interviewed?
In relationship to this case, yes, sir. I don't know of one that happened before this.
Okay. And you were part of that first interview?
Yes, sir.
Now, you talked about the Miranda, but needless to say, he participated in this interview voluntarily.
Yes, sir. The Miranda was more, we did it for every interview we did, just to protect them and ourselves, just in case something came up later and that was valuable in this interview. We wanted to protect their rights.
And during that interview, he acknowledged a relationship with Ms. Chambers. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And as part of this acknowledgement, he talked about how he met Ms. Chambers, which was
Yes.
through Keisha Myers.
Yes, sir.
They were riding, they used to ride around.
Yeah, I believe him and Miss Meyer knew each other, and they were friends, and he met her, Jessica, through that friendship with her.
How did he describe this relationship?
With Jessica,
Yes.
it was a short relationship. I believe he said he'd only known her 2 to 3 weeks, that they exchanged numbers fairly quickly after meeting each other, and that they would talk and text and hang out. She said, I believe he actually told me that she was cool, and he liked to hang out with her.
Right. So they hung out several occasions?
I think the term hung out would be, I don't know, I didn't ask, I don't think we ever talked about how many times they hung out. I think the term hang out would be, we rode around.
Right.
We're together.
It was a cordial relationship.
Yes. And I think I might have confused him when I said intimate, because I don't know that, I thought he might have taken that as girlfriend and boyfriend.
Okay.
And I don't think that was the case.
Now, you also testified that you were aware that Dustin Blunt had confirmed their sexual relationship. Do you recall that part of your
Yes.
testimony? How did you become aware of that?
Well, I mean, of course, in Officer Blunt's report, which would be an FBI 302, where Mr. Tellis showed him the location that we went to today. And of course, Mr. Blunt was part of the team that was at the sheriff's office with us.
What is FBI 302?
So some type of report. It
Is
would
there
be-
any reason why you remember this report specifically by number?
Because that's what they call them, is FBI 302s.
Oh, so any report from the FBI would be a 302?
That's right.
Okay. Now, this initial interview was fairly brief. I believe you indicated 10 minutes or so?
Probably 15 minutes at the most.
Okay. Now, you talked about, in response to a question by Mr. Hale, about this social media explosion. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
Now, when you say social media explosion, what do you mean by that?
It's just, the news, of course, the news was handling this as a very much so a tragedy as it was. And you had people, be it, I call them armchair detectives or wannabe guy, everybody was exploding with something on Facebook or Twitter or something as to who had done this and why.
And this was prior to the time when you interviewed Mr. Tellis?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it was from the very start. I mean, it was, this was very highly publicized from the start.
Now, at your instruction, a lot of the first responders composed statements.
Yes.
And I believe it's your instruction. Was that correct?
I would say it probably was me. I mean, I don't know that it could have been Lieutenant Dixon, but I'll take the blame for it. I probably did tell them to go ahead and immediately write statements. This is what they remember happening,
I think that was very good.
which is common for a
instruction.
lay witness. I mean, I wouldn't. That's what we always do.
And I wouldn't try to blame you there, Mr. Douglas. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. There was testimony that, from some of the first responders that they got an admonishment to go ahead and prepare a statement and to do it fairly quickly.
I mean,
believe
I
there was-
probably would have told Daniel to get them together the next day and have them write a statement while it's fresh on their mind.
Was that, why would you do that?
I mean, it's been, in my experience as an investigator, somebody that's a lay witness or not a suspect or a victim probably is going to remember more while it's fresh on their mind as opposed to waiting.
That makes sense to me. And when they actually prepared these statements, did you actually collect them, or was there a common drop-off
I
area?
believe
for them?
Daniel probably, he did collect them all and bring them to me.
And that would be Daniel Cole?
Yes, sir.
And then he turned those over to you?
Yes, sir.
Did you interview any of these first responders during the course of your investigation?
No, sir. I believe there were some follow-up interviews done on the first responders, maybe to clarify or clear up information. And I believe maybe some of the helicopter staff, that was done by FBI and other agents, not myself.
Okay. So the helicopter people may have been interviewed, but none of the, and if you know, I'm just curious whether some of the first responders, like the volunteer firemen, the ambulance people, were they interviewed in relation to the statements?
Throughout the entire investigation, I cannot be 100% sure, but I do believe some of the firefighters were re-interviewed for clarification, but that would not have been done by me.
Okay. And that would have been done by some of the other
I
law
think
enforcement?
I think it was done by the FBI. FBI did several follow-up interviews with medical people and first responders.
Okay. Are you aware of any additional statements that would have been produced as a result of these follow-up interviews?
No, sir.
Now, you indicated that you collected information, or information was collected in regard to a Derrick Holmes.
Yes, sir.
And I believe you testified that that name actually came from Mr. Tellis
Yes.
during this initial interview?
Yes,
And you talked about him being cleared.
yes.
Were you involved in that process?
And the actual clearing,
Yes.
no, sir. I did the initial contact interview to gather his information, which was turned over to Investigator Rowlett. Rowlett would have performed everything from there. And also, like I said, there was a follow-up interview did with him after me by Investigator Douglas.
And I know that, and you may have alluded to this, Mr. Thompson, but there were numerous individuals interviewed, investigated early on in this investigation.
Yes,
And at some point, some of these individuals would have been cleared
Yeah,
and moved
by-
on to other people.
that's right. And Investigator Rowlett later will explain that better than I can as to how he cleared them.
Certainly.
And that was done via computer or other methods.
Was there any communication directed toward you that would let you know that an individual had been cleared?
At times, maybe, but I think his investigation expanded in deeper and out after I was back in the courtroom, and he continued to work on this case continually.
Okay.
So probably after the end of December, probably not.
At some point, Mr. Tellis was cleared early on in this investigation.
I believe, he was not a viable suspect at that time, yes.
Let me say it like this. At some point, you're all looking at Mr. Tellis, cleared him, although we know now that you came back and took a second look at him.
That's correct.
That's fair to say?
That's correct.
Okay. And that was the case with many suspects early on, correct?
Yes.
Now, you took a DNA sample from Mr. Tellis,
I did,
okay? And I believe Officer Dixon was present when that happened?
yes.
You swabbed a lot of individuals during this process, did you not?
Myself and other investigators as well, yes.
And a lot of those tests were actually submitted to, I believe, Scales.
That's correct, sir.
That's a place in Brandon, Mississippi.
Yes.
Is that where your tests are typically sent?
That's where we send all of our DNA testing.
Okay. They actually provide you with the collection.
That's
kits,
correct,
right?
sir.
Y'all
Yes.
have a contract with Scales for collection DNA?
No, it's just, not to say that they're any better than the Mississippi Crime Lab, but in a case like this and other cases, they are usually more timely.
Now, that's the court's indulgence.
Yes, sir.
Now, early on, there were several pieces there were several items sent to Scales for testing.
Yes,
Is that correct? Were you involved in sending those items to Scales?
no,
Okay, but you're aware that they were sent to Scales?
yes,
Okay, and we talked about the keys being sent to Scales.
yes,
And there was also a sample from Ms. Chambers actually sent to Scales. Are you aware of that?
I don't have, if you hand me the submission form, I'll verify it, but I don't know exactly what all was sent originally.
Okay. Mr. Holmes, are you aware that his information was submitted to Scales? Just if you know.
I'm not sure.
What about Jerry Lee King?
If you,
Just
four
if you
years
know.
ago, without seeing the submission form, I can't tell you if it was submitted or not. I'm not gonna say that I could assume, but that wouldn't
Certainly.
do any good for either one of us.
Wouldn't want you to do that. Now, you made reference to a search that would have been performed, I believe, by Mr. Cole.
It would have been headed by him and a team that he put together. It would have been supervised by one or more investigators from some agency.
Were you present when that search was actually conducted?
No, sir.
Do you know what area was searched?
No, sir. I know the general area was where we were today. How far out they went, I don't, somebody else would have to testify. Daniel Cole would probably have to testify to that.
Certainly, and this search was actually put together as a result of those keys being found in that area?
It probably would have been done at some point anyway. A neighborhood canvass is common at some point, just to look for stuff. But being those keys were found a distance from the scene, it was probably done sooner than it would have been normally done.
Now, at the point early on in this investigation, I believe you made reference to a meeting that took place there at the Sheriff's Department.
Yes,
I believe that meeting took place the very next day.
I wasn't present at the very first meeting. I think they met again early Sunday morning and maybe went back to the scene. Then I would have been present Sunday afternoon just to kind of go through things. And then the federal help and the state help started flowing in Monday, where we had set up our conference room as a command post, and everybody was meeting there and working out of the conference room.
So there would have been two meetings that took place on December the 7th. One early in the morning and then one later in the day.
I wouldn't have been there at the early meeting. I think, according to Mr. Hale, when his direct examination was that Edward, I believe, had went back out to the scene early that morning. Or Lieutenant Dixon. I don't know if he met anybody to go out there or not. But he went back to the scene that morning.
Mr. Dixon.
Yes,
Well,
in the daylight. I wasn't present. If he met anybody or anybody went with him, I went to the sheriff's office Sunday after lunch. And that was the first hands-on meeting I was at.
And that's the meeting I'm referring to.
Yes, sir.
Are you aware of a meeting? Well, you were aware of that meeting. That took place the second day, which would have been December 7th,
Yes,
the day after Ms. Chambers met her demise.
yes,
And that meeting would have taken place December 7th, that afternoon.
yes.
Who was present at that meeting?
Exactly who all was there, I don't know. Probably the sheriff and our chief and some of our investigators. I'm not exactly sure who all was there. I believe some of our marshals were there. We have a team that works for the marshals, or a guy that's assigned to the marshal.
And that was there at the Sheriff's Department.
Yes,
And there wasn't a meeting earlier that morning that you're aware of?
I wasn't present. if
You
there
weren't
was
present, so you don't know?
one. No.
Okay. That's course indulgence.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Thompson, I want to ask you about some specific individuals, and I want to know if you were involved in any interviews that may have involved these individuals, if you know.
Okay.
We talked about Derek Holmes just now. Did you ever have an occasion to interview Mr. Holmes?
One contact interview.
You had one contact. What about Jerry Lee King?
No,
Did you interview Mr. King?
No.
Did you have any other contact with him?
no.
Okay. What about Lakeisha Meyer?
Yes, sir. I was in on, like I told you earlier, I believe I might have sat in on a couple of her interviews.
Okay. And we know about the interview with Quintelis.
Yes.
Did you interview a Rachel Denise Tudor, Mister?
Probably was sitting in on an interview with her, yeah. I think myself and Investigator Douglas did an interview with her.
Okay. What about George Douglas, Mister Jr.?
Probably at the same time they came in together.
Okay. So do you recall the circumstance? Did you actually interview Mister? That's something. Did you interview Mister
I'm not
in connection
exactly sure.
with this particular crime?
Yes.
You did.
I was part of the interview. I'm not knowing if I was the note taker, the question asker, but there was many people that were interviewed through this
So-
whole deal, yes.
But you specifically remember interviewing him?
I remember Boone and Rachel, yes.
How do you know Mr.? Well, let me ask you like this. Does Mr. Boone go by any other name?
Mr. George Mister goes by Boone Mister.
Boone, Mister. Gotcha. Did you interview Anna King?
That was an infant, no.
What about Mary Tyner?
No.
And you're aware that biological samples were collected on individuals, but you're not aware of how those samples may have gotten to the crime, to scales?
I'm sure they were hand-delivered by an investigator. As to which one, I don't know.
Okay. I'll turn to the witness, Your Honor.
All right. Redirect.
Mary, just so there's no, excuse me, Major Thompson, just so there's no confusion, any information you would have received in regards to phone records would not have been collected by you.
No.
And you mentioned three primary, the word investigators, that handled this case. There were two criminal investigators that were handling this case, is that correct?
That's correct. Agent Scott Meadows and MBI investigator Tim Douglas are certified investigators, and
I just want to clear this up.
Paul Rowlett is an intel analyst.
Okay. Paul Rowlett is not a criminal investigator that's going out collecting all this data.
No.
These items.
That's right.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the social media explosion
That's right.
and all the tips and information we get. I mean, truth be known, a girl just got burned alive. Is that correct?
Yes,
And everybody likes to get on Facebook and talk.
absolutely.
Final thing, he asked you about confirming things that Quentin said. When you state that he and Keisha Meyer were friends and that he met Jessica through Keisha, who told you that?
Him?
And when Mr. Peterson referred to Dustin Blunt confirming a sexual encounter, both of those statements, the original and the confirmation, came from who?
Quentin, tell us.
Did anyone else tell you that information?
Other than Lakeisha confirming, but the direct information came from Quentin Teller.
Did Keisha ever confirm them having sex?
No.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right. What instructions would you give the witness?
I would ask this witness to be finally released.
Major, you're fine release, sir.
Thank you, Your
Back
Honor.
to the courtroom and back to duty, sir. Your choice.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. We're going to break for the after, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to put you in your jury room for a few minutes. I may want to call you back out before I let you retire for the evening. Actually, we're going to go to the scene again tonight at 8 o'clock, and you know that. And you're going to be fed in your rooms tonight before you go out there. And so, but we may want to take just a little more testimony before then. I don't know yet. The lawyers are working on that now. If they can't do it within a reasonable amount of time, then I'm gonna let you go on and go back to your hotel. So if you'll just stand in your jury room there for a few moments, I'll have an announcement about that later. Okay, thank you.